I'm Asher, I'm 28, and for most of my life, I've been the quiet one in my family, the kind of person who lets things slide to keep the peace. My mom used to call me the calm in the storm, which was her way of saying I was the one who didn't talk back while my older sister, Eliza, and my dad ran their mouths about everything and everyone. Growing up, our house was full of noise, arguments over who worked harder, who deserved more, who was grateful enough. I tried to tune it out, bury myself in school, in work, in anything that didn't involve walking on eggshells. But no matter how much I tried to distance myself, my family always had a way of pulling me back in, usually when they needed something. The story I'm about to tell doesn't start with a fight or some dramatic event. It started quietly, like most disasters do. I had just come back from a business trip, exhausted but proud. I'd been working for nearly 5 years to build my own design firm from scratch. It wasn't huge, but it was stable and mine. My parents never really understood what I did. To them, if you weren't working a real job in an office or a hospital, it didn't count. They thought I was just freelancing, despite me showing them contracts, invoices, and even magazine features that had my name on them. It never mattered. Eliza, on the other hand, could do no wrong. She married young, divorced richer, and somehow convinced everyone that she was the family success story. The first time I noticed something off was about a month before everything fell apart. My mom called me one afternoon, her tone overly sweet, the kind she only used when she wanted something. "Honey," she said, dragging the word out like honey itself. "You remember how you promised to help family when you finally made it big?" I frowned, sitting back in my chair. "I never said that, Mom," I replied carefully. "I said I'd help out if I could, but, oh, come on, Asher," she interrupted, chuckling as if it were all a joke. "It's just a little favor. Eliza's trying to start something new. A boutique. She has the perfect eye for it, you know? She just needs a small loan to get it off the ground. We all agreed you'd want to help." The "we all" part made my stomach tighten. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, though I already regretted it. "Not much," Mom said, in that practiced, minimizing tone. "Just 25,000. You can afford that now, right? You're doing so well." I remember sitting there in silence, my hand gripping the phone as if it could steady me. 25,000 wasn't not much. It was money I'd saved for expanding my office, hiring another designer, maybe even taking a real vacation for once. I told her no, firmly, politely. "I'm not lending money to family," I said. "It never ends well." There was a pause. Then came the sigh, her famous disappointed sigh. "I just hope you remember this conversation when you need help one day," she said coldly before hanging up. That was the beginning of the tension. For the next few weeks, I noticed the small ways my family started pulling back. Mom stopped calling as often. Dad, who usually texted me about sports, went quiet. Even Eliza stopped liking my posts online, which sounds childish, but when your family treats social media as a scoreboard for affection, it stands out. I told myself it was fine. Maybe it was time to let the distance grow. Maybe peace meant silence. But peace, as I would soon learn, was never something my family could tolerate for long. 2 weeks later, I got an invitation. A formal one, white card, gold lettering, the whole thing. Family celebration dinner, it said, hosted by my parents at their house. The same house I'd grown up in, the one that still smelled faintly of old carpet cleaner and my dad's aftershave. The invitation was signed. "Let's reconnect. Love, Mom." Against my better judgment, I went. Maybe part of me wanted to believe they were trying to mend things. Or maybe I just didn't want to be the kind of son who ignored his family. When I arrived, the first thing that hit me wasn't nostalgia, it was the music. Loud, upbeat, expensive sounding. The living room was filled with people I barely recognized. Neighbors, Eliza's friends, a few cousins who never came to family events unless there was food or gossip involved. My mom saw me and lit up like she'd just seen a celebrity. "There he is," she called out, pulling me into a hug that felt more for show than affection. "Everyone, this is my son, the entrepreneur." People clapped. My dad patted me on the back. Eliza smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Wow, Ash," she said, swirling her drink. "You actually showed up. I thought you were too busy being successful to hang out with us peasants." I forced a smile. "You invited me," I said simply. "Well, technically Mom invited you," she replied, smirking. "But hey, we're all family. What's a little tension between siblings, right?" Her words dripped with that casual cruelty she'd perfected over the years. Dinner was worse. They'd made my favorite meal, roast chicken with herbs, but the air was thick with unspoken jabs. My dad asked how my little design hobby was going. My mom made a point of saying how proud she was of Eliza for taking initiative with her boutique idea, especially since not everyone in the family believes in supporting dreams. Every sentence was a knife disguised as small talk. I tried to stay calm, smile through it, sip my water, and pretend it didn't sting. But when Eliza leaned forward and said, "You know, Ash, if you'd just been a bit more generous, you could have been part of something big. Now when my boutique takes off, you'll just be watching from the sidelines." I couldn't help but respond. "Eliza," I said quietly, "you don't even have a business plan. You just want free money." The table went silent. My mother's fork clinked against her plate. "Asher," she hissed, "don't embarrass your sister." "I'm not embarrassing her," I said, my voice calm but tight. "I'm just stating the truth." Eliza crossed her arms and leaned back, smirking. There it is. The real Asher. Always so high and mighty. I left soon after that. The dinner had clearly been a setup, a stage for Eliza to play victim and for me to be the villain. I didn't even make it to my car before my phone buzzed with a text from my mom. "You ruined the evening." I tried to move on after that night, but something changed. Things started going wrong in ways that felt deliberate. A client I'd been working with suddenly backed out of a project, saying they'd heard some concerning things about me. My business bank account showed a strange transaction that I hadn't made, small, but enough to make me suspicious. And when I confronted the bank, they told me the transfer had come from someone with my mother's last name. That was when I realized this wasn't just petty family drama anymore. Someone, maybe all of them, were trying to get something from me. And when I refused, they decided to take it another way. I didn't know it then, but everything that happened next would make that dinner look like a warm-up. Because a few nights later, I got a message that said, "You knew I would find out, didn't you?" I didn't recognize the number. And when I looked up from my phone, I swear I saw a shadow move past my window. For the next few days after that strange message, I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe it was just a wrong number, or maybe someone was trying to scare me for a laugh. I even deleted it, convincing myself it meant nothing. But deep down, I couldn't shake the unease. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected another message to appear. Every creak in the hallway at night made me tense. It was like my body knew something my mind wasn't ready to admit yet, that this wasn't random. The real breaking point didn't come all at once. It started in fragments, a missing document here, a strange phone call there, each one small enough to ignore on its own. But together, they formed a pattern. One morning, I got an email from one of my long-term clients, a real estate firm I'd been designing layouts for over a year. The tone was polite but cold. "Asher, after careful consideration, we've decided to terminate our contract effective immediately. We appreciate your past work, but given the recent concerns, we believe it's best to move on." No explanation. No warning. I called them right away, heart pounding. The project manager, a woman named Dana, sounded hesitant. "Look, Asher, I shouldn't say much, but someone reached out to us. They claimed you'd been misusing client funds and reselling design templates under other names. I know that doesn't sound like you, but the board doesn't want to risk bad press." For a second, I couldn't even breathe. "That's not true," I said firmly. "You know that's not true." "I do," she replied. "But whoever contacted us sent screenshots, bank transfers, invoices, even an email thread that looked convincing." It felt like the ground dropped beneath me. "Can you tell me who sent it?" "I can't," she said softly. "I'm sorry." And then the line went dead. For hours, I sat at my desk, staring at the monitor without seeing it. My hands were shaking. Someone had gone out of their way to fabricate lies, detailed ones. Only a person who knew me well could pull that off. Someone with access to personal information. Someone who knew my banking details. And then it hit me. The transfer I'd seen earlier, the one under my mother's last name. My mother didn't use technology much. She barely knew how to use her phone properly. But Eliza? She had studied marketing before dropping out. She was tech-savvy, manipulative, charming when she wanted to be, cruel when it suited her. And she'd had access to my family's information for years. The thought made my stomach twist. I called her immediately. She didn't answer. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. I sent a short message. "We need to talk. Now." Hours passed. No reply. By the next day, I was furious. I drove to my parents' house, that same house where they'd hosted the dinner, determined to get answers. When I arrived, I noticed a brand new car in the driveway. A luxury model. I knew neither of my parents could afford that. My chest tightened. Mom answered the door with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. Asher, what a surprise. You should have called first. I tried, I said coldly. Where's Eliza? Her expression flickered for a moment before settling back into false calm. She's out. What? Because someone sent forged documents to my clients, I said, stepping inside before she could block me. Someone with access to my financial information. And that person used our family name. Mom's lips tightened. You're accusing your sister of fraud now? Honestly, Asher, I don't know what's gotten into you lately. Ever since you got that company of yours, you've turned paranoid. Don't, I said quietly. Don't try to make me sound crazy. Just tell me, did you or Dad give Eliza access to anything with my name on it? A file, a password, a document. She folded her arms. Even if we did, she's family. We share things in this house. I laughed, a hollow sound. Share? You mean she takes whatever she wants, and you look the other way? Her expression hardened. Don't talk about your sister that way. She's been through a lot. I took a deep breath. I've been through a lot too, Mom. But I didn't drag anyone down with me. That's when she said it, the line that stuck with me for days afterward. Maybe you wouldn't have to worry so much if you just helped her when we asked. It was like the air left the room. I realized then that she knew. Maybe not the full extent, but enough. Enough to know that Eliza had done something behind my back and to justify it as family business. I left before I said something I couldn't take back. But inside, something broke. That quiet, tolerant part of me that had spent years letting them walk all over me. It finally cracked. 2 days later, I got another message. Same unknown number. You think you're so clever. But you knew I'd find out. Attached was a photo, my office door, taken from the outside. I felt my pulse in my ears. Someone had been there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me flinch. Around midnight, I finally turned on the lights, sat at my desk, and opened my security footage. Nothing at first, until 11:47 p.m. A figure in a hooded jacket approached the building, tried the handle, then turned to face the camera for a split second. Even with the low quality, I recognized the shape of the jaw, the way she tilted her head. Eliza. The next morning, I went to confront her. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just drove straight to her apartment, my hands gripping the wheel tight enough to hurt. When she opened the door, she looked almost amused. Well, if it isn't my favorite brother, she said, leaning against the frame. To what do I owe the pleasure? Cut the act, I said. You've been sabotaging me. You've forged documents, sent fake emails, and now you're showing up at my office in the middle of the night. What? Her expression shifted, just for a second. Surprise, maybe guilt, but then she smiled again. Oh, Asher, you always think everything revolves around you. Don't lie to me. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. You want the truth? Fine. You never helped us. You've been sitting on your money, acting like you're better than us. So yeah, I took something. Consider it payback. Payback. I repeated, my voice shaking. For what? For working hard? For not bailing you out of every bad decision? You think you're perfect, she snapped. You always have. Mom and Dad see it too. You think you're smarter than everyone, but you're not. You're just lucky. I stared at her, speechless. You destroyed my reputation because of jealousy? She crossed her arms, smiling coldly. You'll bounce back. You always do. Besides, it's not like you lost everything yet. That last word lingered like a threat. I left her apartment shaking with anger and disbelief. But as I drove home, that single word kept replaying in my head. Yet. That night, I got a call from my accountant. Asher, he said nervously, you need to check your business account right now. There's been a series of withdrawals over the last 48 hours. Large ones. When I opened my banking app, my blood ran cold. Tens of thousands were gone. I knew immediately who had done it. The next few days were chaos. My lawyer confirmed what I already suspected. The withdrawals had been made using forged authorization forms, and the signature matched mine almost perfectly. Whoever did it had studied my handwriting. Then came the worst blow. My parents refused to believe me. When I went to them, shaking, furious, demanding answers, my mom just sighed and said, Asher, I think you need help. You've always been so suspicious of Eliza. Maybe you should talk to someone about that. It was gaslighting, pure and simple. I felt like I was losing my mind. Everyone around me acted as if I was the problem, while Eliza played the innocent daughter, crying about how her brother hates her. I tried to stay composed, tried to focus on salvaging what I could of my business. But that's when the betrayal hit its peak. A close friend from work called me, voice trembling. Asher, I don't know how to say this, but someone's been spreading things about you online. They made a fake Reddit account using your name, posting stories about scamming clients. It's getting traction. I went numb. It was one thing to lose money, but this was a calculated attempt to destroy me completely. By then, I knew it wasn't just Eliza acting alone. She wasn't that careful. My parents were helping her, or at least covering for her. That night, I sat in my dark living room, scrolling through post after post about me. Angry clients that didn't exist, fake screenshots, people calling me a fraud. My entire reputation was unraveling in real time. I remember whispering to myself, they wouldn't go this far. But deep down, I knew they already had. And then came the moment that burned itself into my memory forever. It was 3 nights later. I was sitting in my office, trying to draft a statement for my clients, when I heard a faint sound, a creak, like someone opening the door downstairs. My building was locked. My assistant had left hours ago. I froze, listening. Footsteps. I stood, heart hammering, and turned toward the glass door that led to the hallway. Through the reflection, I saw a movement. And then a voice, soft, low, trembling. You knew I would find out, didn't you? It was Eliza. Her voice echoed through the quiet. Before I could even react, the door to my office slammed open. A second voice followed, deeper, colder, unfamiliar. We're here to take everything back. I froze in place, staring at the doorway as 2 figures stood there. Eliza, smirking as if she'd just won some cruel game, and a man I didn't recognize, tall and imposing, his presence immediately setting my nerves on edge. My first thought was disbelief. How had they gotten in? I lived in a building with high security, passcodes, cameras, locked entrances. But even as the shock froze me, adrenaline kicked in. I needed to think fast. Who are you? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. The man didn't answer immediately. He just stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, giving me enough space to notice the confidence in his gait. Let's just say, he said finally, voice calm but authoritative, we're here to settle some old debts. Consider it family business. My stomach turned. That word again, family. I'd spent years trying to distance myself, trying to protect myself from their manipulations, and now here they were, like vultures circling something I'd worked so hard to build. Eliza laughed, lightly, almost like a tinkle of glass breaking. See, Ash? I told you. You can't hide from us forever. I took a cautious step back, my mind racing. There was no way I could fight both of them, not physically. And even if I could, what would that accomplish? No, I needed a plan. I needed to survive this. Fine, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. You want money? You want my company? Take what you can, but this isn't going to end the way you think. Eliza tilted her head. Oh, Ash, always so dramatic. I'm not here for your money, at least, not entirely. I want you to see what happens when you push people too far. The man beside her finally spoke again. We've already done a lot of damage. It's time you feel it. And believe me, you will. Something inside me snapped, but not the kind that makes you fight blindly. No, this was different. I felt a cold clarity descend over me, like the storm inside my chest had finally settled into a sharp edge. I knew I couldn't let them break me. I wouldn't let them. That night, I barely slept. I went through every possible scenario in my head. How could they have gotten into my accounts, my systems, my life? How could they have orchestrated all of this so seamlessly? Every moment I thought I had control, they had been quietly dismantling it behind my back. I felt a mix of rage and despair. But somewhere underneath that, a small, stubborn ember of determination flickered. The next morning, I called in my lawyer and explained everything. The forged transfers, the online harassment, the break-in attempt. He didn't sugarcoat it. Asher, he said, you've been hit hard. They've thought this through, and you're going to need a strategy. But it's not over. Not by a long shot. That conversation was both a relief and a grim reminder. I had hit rock bottom. My finances were a mess. My business reputation had taken a hit. And yet, I still had my mind, my skills, my ability to fight back. I started rebuilding quietly. First, I secured my accounts, changed passwords, hired IT experts to fortify my systems. I reached out to clients individually, explaining the situation without exposing too much family drama. After all, I didn't want my business to suffer further. It took patience, tact, and a lot of late nights, but slowly, trust began to return. Meanwhile, I started working on my own edge, refining my designs, creating projects that were stronger, smarter, and more marketable than ever before. Every late night spent poring over layouts, every extra hour negotiating contracts, every call I made personally to reassure clients became part of my quiet revenge. Not a loud confrontation, but proof that I could survive, thrive, and grow stronger even when the people who were supposed to support me tried to tear me down. One evening, about 2 months after that fateful confrontation, I sat in my office reviewing a new proposal for a high-profile client. My phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize. "We underestimated you." "That's impressive." I froze for a second, then smiled. It wasn't a threat, it was an acknowledgement. They had seen that I wasn't broken. They had seen that despite all their sabotage, I had regained footing. Around the same time, I discovered something that would fuel my determination even more. A former associate of Eliza's, someone who had grown disillusioned with her manipulations, reached out to me anonymously. They confirmed much of what I suspected, that my sister had been working in tandem with our parents, using family connections and influence to sabotage me. But they also mentioned cracks in her alliances, mistakes she had made that I could use if I played my cards carefully. I realized then that this wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about reclaiming control over my life and my work. About proving, not just to them, but to myself, that I was capable of far more than they had ever believed. I started documenting everything. Every email, every transaction, every message, every interaction. Each piece of evidence was another tool, another piece of armor against the chaos they had tried to create. And with each passing day, I felt my confidence return, slowly but steadily. The fear that had clutched my chest began to loosen its grip. I also began to reconnect with a few old friends, people who had always believed in me despite my family's whispers and manipulations. They became my support system, a quiet network of reassurance and advice. One of them even suggested bringing in a professional mediator, someone outside the family, to ensure that I had witnesses to everything moving forward. Then came a turning point. I secured a contract with a major client who had previously doubted me due to Eliza's false reports. They didn't just hire me. They commissioned me to design an entire marketing campaign for a launch that would be featured nationally. It wasn't just a financial win, it was a personal one. A validation that all the sabotage, all the gaslighting, all the emotional manipulation couldn't stop me. I started feeling a shift within myself. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was proactive. I was planning. I was learning how to anticipate attacks and prevent them before they could hit. Each step I took was careful, deliberate, and calculated. I was building a fortress around my life, piece by piece. But despite the progress, the shadow of my family still lingered. I knew Eliza wasn't done. I knew my parents would never admit fault. And I knew that somewhere, they were watching, waiting for a moment to strike again. That knowledge was both terrifying and exhilarating. It meant that when the time came to confront them, I wouldn't be the same person they had tried to break. I'd be stronger, smarter, prepared. Late one night, I found myself looking at the city skyline from my office window, a glass of whiskey in hand, reflecting on everything that had happened. The destruction, the betrayal, the fear. It had been crushing, but it had also forced me to evolve. I realized that for the first time in my life, I was truly independent. Not just financially, but mentally, emotionally, strategically. And that's when the plan began to form in my mind. Not a reckless revenge, but a meticulous one. Something that would make them regret underestimating me. Something that would remind them that I was not the weak, compliant son they thought they could manipulate. I didn't know yet exactly how it would unfold, but I knew the path forward. Every call, every deal, every late night of strategy was part of it. I had hit rock bottom, yes, but from that depth, I was climbing. Slowly, deliberately, and with a purpose that burned hotter than anger. A purpose rooted in reclaiming my life, my reputation, and my sense of justice. Then, one morning, a package arrived at my office. It wasn't addressed formally. It was just my name, scrawled in handwriting that sent a chill down my spine. I opened it carefully, my pulse quickening. Inside was a small note and a USB drive. The note said simply, "You can try to rebuild, but remember, we know your secrets too." I held the drive in my hand, staring at it. My stomach twisted. My fingers itched to throw it across the room. But instead, I did something I hadn't done since this all began. I smiled. Because for the first time, I realized something important. This time, they weren't in control. Not really. I had fallen, yes. I had been pushed to the edge. But now I was rising. And when the time came, I would decide how this ended. From the night the USB arrived, things shifted from reactive to intentional. Up until then, my moves had been about damage control, patching holes, calming clients, filing police reports that went nowhere because family members had more convincing lies than I had proof. But that little drive changed the tenor of everything. Whoever sent it wanted me rattled. They wanted leverage. They assumed fear would make me sloppy. Instead, it made me methodical. The first thing I did was exactly what I should have done months ago. I stopped trying to fight them alone. Pride had kept me quiet for a long time. I thought I could handle betrayal with grit and late nights. That pride almost cost me everything. So I called the people who actually mattered, the ones with skills and nerve, not the ones who traded in manipulation and sentiment. I started with Mara, my IT consultant. She'd been the one who helped me secure accounts and trace the initial fake transfers. She answered on the second ring, voice flat, but warm when she realized it was me. "Bring me the drive," she said. "Don't open it on your machine. Meet me tomorrow." Mara set the tone for what came next. Clinical, pragmatic, and quietly fierce. She cloned the drive in a locked lab environment, ran forensic checks, and extracted metadata that pointed to more than casual nastiness. The USB wasn't just a scare tactic. It contained fragments of emails, copies of authorization forms with my forged signature, and a batch of files that had been accessed from a local IP address tied to a cafe near Eliza's neighborhood. It was the kind of breadcrumb trail you could either follow or ignore. I followed it. While Mara handled the tech, I reached out to Jonah, an old college friend who'd gone into corporate law. Jonah and I hadn't been close for years, but when I told him everything, his voice sharpened. "You've got motive, means, and precedent on their side," he said. "Which means you need an airtight paper trail. Let me subpoena what I can. Bank logs, IP records, phone records. We'll build a timeline that's impossible to call coincidence." He didn't ask for payment up front. He asked for facts. That felt like a small mercy. Then there was Lila, my former business partner. We'd parted on uneasy terms 3 years ago, and I'd been too proud to pick up the phone when things went south. Reaching out to her felt like swallowing something bitter, but she answered and surprised me. "You need allies who know how to move in places you can't," she told me. Lila had contacts in PR and a quiet network of clients who respected competence more than gossip. She promised to keep an ear to the ground, to discreetly check rumors and soften the narrative for anyone on the fence. Slowly, I assembled a loose coalition. Mara for data and cyber trace, Jonah for legal muscle, Lila for reputational triage. A former associate of Eliza who'd reached out anonymously and offered insights on her sister's habits and holes. And one quiet surprise, my neighbor Mr. Klein, a retired journalist who'd been the one to publish an early piece that mentioned my firm years ago. He'd watched my family from the outside for decades and irritated him was something I underestimated. He offered to keep tabs on local gossip and, if needed, expose inconsistencies in a way that wouldn't look like I was trying to silence anyone. With them in my corner, my approach changed. I stopped trying to prove what had been done to me to people who had no reason to care and started building a case that could not be shrugged off. The aim wasn't vengeance for the sake of cruelty. It was accountability. I wanted the truth to be undeniable and public enough that it couldn't be rewritten into the family myth my parents liked to tell. The next few weeks were a blur of quiet, surgical work. Mara traced the IP usage and showed me the rough hours the fake invoices were uploaded. There were gaps, a few VPNs, a couple of burner phones, but the human errors were there too. Eliza had rushed one transfer at 2:17 a.m. and had used a coffee shop's Wi-Fi she frequented on Sunday mornings. That was the kind of slip she'd make when she was confident she could dodge suspicion. Jonah issued subpoenas and quietly pressured banks to reopen the files. He found a signature sample from a notarized document where someone had forged my name and used the notary's lax verification to do it. Lila reached out to two key clients, not to rail against the family, but to present them with facts and an alternative narrative that placed me back in the center of control over my work. Mr. Klein started a rumor in the exact way a journalist should, with precision. He asked one pointed question in a neighborhood column about how often family quibbles contaminate local businesses and watched the responses. People answered, and one answer led to another, and slowly the public perception shifted. Parallel to all this, I was working on my own front. I set up two dummy accounts, a staged freelance profile, and seeded a small, controlled project online to test responses. If someone tried to impersonate me again, I wanted to catch them in the act. I also began fencing off my personal life with meticulous care. New locks, a discreet security upgrade to the building, and even a second P.O. box under an assumed company name for sensitive mail. I learned to expect duplicity, and I learned to make it costly. But if the goal was accountability, I also needed leverage. Evidence was one thing, leverage was another. I thought about what my family valued, their social standing, credit with local banks, the boutique idea Eliza had been angling for, and the shiny car in the driveway that suddenly appeared after my company began flourishing. They loved being seen as the generous, suffering family who merely sacrificed for their golden child. I needed to ask, what did they fear losing more than money? Reputation, yes. Exposure, yes. The sense of being the moral center of our neighborhood, absolutely. That's where the plan started to take shape. It wasn't a single explosive act. It was a series of careful moves designed to squeeze their safe spaces until they had to react publicly. The idea was to force a convergence, a moment where the private lies could no longer be shielded by closed doors and quiet sighs. I wanted witnesses. I wanted independent voices that would not be easily swayed by a practiced sob story at the dinner table. The opportunity came more quickly than I expected. Our neighborhood had an annual charity gala, an event my parents loved. It was their stage, silver-haired acquaintances, clinking glasses, the kind of place where Eliza could photobomb a speech and collect compliments without much effort. This year, the gala's theme was small businesses supporting each other, and the organizers had invited local entrepreneurs to share their stories. It was the perfect stage. If I participated, the night would draw the exact crowd who mattered: clients, bankers, journalists, and neighbors. It also meant my family would most likely show up. They never missed an event where they could be seen doing good and where they could bask in reflected attention when their supposed sacrifices were praised. I didn't decide to confront them at the gala. That would be sloppy and melodramatic. Instead, I thought in terms of dominoes. What if I could orchestrate a reveal that left no room for their usual spin? What if, at the gala, the board announced a formal investigation into a pattern of fraudulent transfers involving local businesses, and that investigation named names based on the subpoenas Jonah was quietly pushing? What if the bank statements and IP logs arrived in the hands of the event's independent auditor the same night the room was full of their peers? It would be public and immediate, the kind of exposure that couldn't be swept under a rug with a dramatic family anecdote about hard times. I floated the idea to Jonah, and he didn't flinch. "We need a clean drop," he said. "If the gala's committee will include a statement, phrased as a recent discovery impacting local businesses, and if we provide the auditor with verified records minutes before the announcement, it will be framed as an external investigation, not a personal vendetta." He liked the optics. Lila liked the publicity potential, a chance to clear my name in front of potential clients who had been on the fence. Mara could tie the digital breadcrumbs to tangible forms. It was surgical. Getting the committee on board was a dance of quiet persuasion. I met with the gala organizer, a woman named Claire who had known my family for years and who genuinely believed in community work. I didn't start with accusations. I presented facts, anonymized logs, a synopsis of the evidence, and framed it as a public interest issue. Claire asked questions, cross-checked dates, and then agreed to a compromise. The gala would run a short segment on protecting small businesses from fraud, featuring a panel discussion and a short statement from someone in the community affected by such schemes. She didn't want a spectacle. She wanted to offer value to attendees. That was all I asked for. While Claire handled the program, Jonah solidified the legal side. He filed motions, pulled records, and worked with the auditor to ensure they would be willing to accept new evidence that night. Lila began to line up clients who would stand beside me if things went public, not as a show of force, but as authentic testimonies that the rumors about me were false. Mr. Klein sent a quiet, sharp email to an old colleague at a local paper, hinting that there might be a story about how family dynamics can affect small businesses in our area. He didn't promise anything explosive, but the mention registered. Eliza's former associate, the one who had been feeding me small, crucial details, offered to be in the audience. If they try to cry on cue, she told me, I'll know, and I'll tell the truth if I have to. Even as these pieces came together, I knew their psychological playbook. My parents thrived on sympathy and performative suffering. Eliza thrived on being the wronged party. Their scripts were predictable because they'd used them for so long. So part of the plan was to ensure those scripts no longer fit. We would bring evidence, decorum, and neutral witnesses into a public space where their usual moves, the disappointed sighs, the dramatic looks of betrayal, would sound hollow rather than convincing. But of course, plans require timing and contingencies. I set up a back channel with Mara that would allow us to push a single, incontrovertible piece of evidence at the right moment. A timestamped transfer trail that matched Eliza's Wi-Fi use and my forged signature. If the gala segment started to stray, or if someone tried to spin the story into a family squabble, Jonah had the green light to submit the document to the auditor and local authorities. Lila had 2 clients on standby to give short statements about how they'd been contacted with fraudulent claims and then later reassured by my actual work. Mr. Klein prepared a column, carefully worded to avoid libel, but rich in gentle skepticism about family narratives that go unchallenged. The anonymous associate agreed to sit in the 3rd row, phone in hand, ready to corroborate specifics if needed. I kept the plan tight and compartmentalized. Only people who absolutely needed to know were told the whole story. I wanted plausible deniability for everyone else. The less they knew, the more credible they'd appear on the night. I also prepared for the possibility that my parents would deny everything and try to counterattack with their own narrative. That's why I insisted that Jonah secure an emergency injunction to freeze any suspicious accounts if necessary. It was dramatic, but practical. Freeze the funds, keep them from moving, and you keep the leverage. There were personal preparations, too. I rehearsed a short, calm statement about protecting small businesses, deliberately not about family. I would let the evidence do the heavy lifting. I also polished my public persona. Simple suit, no bravado, a tone of measured concern rather than righteous fury. I wanted the room to see me as a professional who had been wronged, not as a vengeful son. If I showed desperation, their pity would only make my family's performance more convincing. As the gala approached, messages started arriving from the usual places. Polite inquiries from neighbors, some awkward texts from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, and, more chillingly, a couple of concise messages from an unknown number. Be careful. You're trying to burn bridges that built you. The voice was familiar in its cadence, a threat wrapped in faux nostalgia. It could have been Eliza. It could have been my mother flexing one last time. It didn't matter. I felt steadier than I had in months. The plan was in motion, supported by people who could outmaneuver sentiment with evidence. On the morning of the gala, I woke before dawn. I sat at my window with coffee, watching the street go about its quiet life. I ran through the checklist in my head. Mara had delivered the clean clones to the auditor and left them in a sealed envelope with documented chain of custody. Jonah had his legal team on call. Lila had the clients prepped to speak in neutral, factual terms. Mr. Klein's column had been queued for the evening. My neighbors had been briefed to avoid turning the night into a spectacle. Everything felt meticulous, careful, and inevitable. And yet, even with everything arranged, there was that old, gnawing question in the back of my mind. What if they refused to show? What if my parents decided not to attend the gala and instead deployed a softer, more social media-friendly attack that could be spun faster than we could present evidence? What if they chose silence and let the rumor mill continue, forcing me to keep chasing shadows? I realized then that plans are only as good as the moment you execute them. The difference between control and chaos is the courage to act when the stage is set. I'd spent months building a stage with people I trusted. I had the evidence, the audience, and a legal team that could move at the speed of courts if necessary. All that was left was to walk into the room and let the mechanisms I'd assembled take over. The gala's ballroom smelled faintly of roses and candle wax when I arrived that evening. People milled around, exchanging pleasantries. I felt a strange mix of nerves and clarity. I found Claire and gave her a subtle nod. She smiled and handed me the program card with the panel sequence. My pulse thudded in my throat as the lights dimmed and the MC stepped up to the podium. The room quieted. The night was supposed to be about community and prevention, about best practices and vigilance. It began that way. Speeches about digital security, a short documentary about small businesses and scams, and then the panel. I sat on the side, calm in appearance, while Jonah watched from the back with a legal pad. Lila sat beside me, her presence a steadying force. Mr. Klein was a few rows ahead, camera subtly positioned. When the panel wrapped, Claire stood to make a final announcement. "Before we close," she said, "there's pressing news regarding a local matter that affects many small businesses. We've been presented with documentation this evening that requires investigation." She held up an envelope, the one Mara had left. A murmur spread through the room. Heads turned. I felt my chest tighten in a different way than when fear ruled it. This was the tightening of readiness. At that exact moment, my phone buzzed with a single message from an unknown number. It read, "You won't be the one to decide how this ends." I looked up, and across the room the doors had swung open. My skin went cold, because in the doorway stood my mother, gloved hands clasped, Eliza at her side, and behind them, a man I didn't recognize. The same man who had been at my office the night they'd announced they were taking everything back. The air in the room changed. The murmur dimmed into a hush. And for the first time since this all began, everyone in the room seemed to feel the weight of what might come next. I simply sat there, the envelope heavy in Claire's hand, Jonah's eyes locked on mine, and the plan I'd spent months building reaching the threshold of execution. And then, before anyone could move, the man behind my family stepped forward and said into the quiet, "We're not here to make a scene. We're here to ensure the truth is returned to its rightful owners." I'll admit, when the man stepped forward and spoke those measured words, "We're not here to make a scene. We're here to ensure the truth is returned to its rightful owners." For a breathless second, I still felt the old panic crawl back. This was the exact kind of drama my family loved. A podium, an audience, the chance to turn everything into a story where they were the tragic heroes. But then Claire opened the envelope, and the room held its breath like ocean water suspended over a cliff. Inside were copies of bank logs, notarized authorizations, IP traces, and a clean report from Mara's lab showing metadata timestamps that lined up with the transactions and Eliza's Wi-Fi use. Jonah, unreadable as ever, rose and handed the auditor a sealed affidavit. He spoke slowly, without theatrics. "These documents were obtained under subpoena. We are not accusing without foundation. We are presenting evidence that this is an organized scheme to defraud small businesses and misappropriate funds. We request the auditor and local authorities to begin a formal investigation." You could hear a pin drop. My parents' faces changed the way an actor's does when the cue for real emotion finally arrives. There was the flash of instinct to compose, to make a show of something noble, but their practiced responses hit the cold logic of evidence and didn't land. Eliza's smile faltered in the exact way I'd seen it falter when she'd been caught in a petty lie years ago. I remember thinking, resentfully, how much time they'd spent perfecting those facades and how fragile they really were. Then Claire did something I hadn't expected. She handed the envelope back to the auditor and asked simply, "Will you accept this for immediate review and, if warranted, present it to the proper authorities?" The auditor, a woman with the no-nonsense gaze of someone who'd seen 1,000 small claims and community squabbles, nodded. "Yes, we will begin our review tonight and submit our findings to law enforcement." At that moment, the man who had accompanied my family, the one from my office break-in, stepped forward and said, quietly, "You might want to take a moment to consider your statements under oath." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He was a private investigator Jonah had retained months earlier, someone with a calm, unblinking manner who'd been building his own dossier. He handed a small stack of printed messages to the auditor, messages showing attempts to coordinate witness statements, notes about who to contact with the sob story, and a timeline match to the forged transfers. Whoever they had thought they were dealing with hadn't expected the coordinated approach we'd mounted or the people we'd pulled in. A few things happened fast, and others unfolded like slow creases. The gala, which had felt like a threat or a hope depending on the hour, became a tribunal of truth delivered without vengeance. People who had been on the fence listened to the dry facts of transactions and timelines. My clients, discreet and composed, gave neutral statements about how they had been contacted with false claims that never materialized and how my work had, in fact, been exemplary. Mr. Klein's column appeared online minutes after the event, not as a smear, but as a measured piece about the dangers of family loyalty overriding accountability. The tenor of the room shifted from gossip to professional concern. My parents tried their usual moves. My mother's voice caught when she spoke to the crowd. "We've always done our best for our family." My father, who had always been a man of few words, attempted a half explanation about misunderstandings and youthful mistakes. Eliza, faced with the swirl of facts, performed the role she knew best: wounded, wronged, surprised at the cruelty of being suspected. But the thing about evidence is that it is not sympathetic to performance. The notary records, the IP logs, the bank authorizations with the forged signature, these were cold, specific, and ugly in a way that didn't listen to sob stories. By midnight, police officers were at the gala, quietly taking statements. They asked Eliza to come to the station for questioning. She agreed, almost theatrically, saying she had nothing to hide. I watched her go, watched my parents' faces in the headlights of police cars. There was a look of anger on my father's face, not because his actions had been called into question, but because he suddenly realized social standing could be stripped as simply as a badge being placed on a table. In the weeks that followed, small revelations cascaded. The local bank reopened their files and, under pressure from Jonah and the auditor, reversed several of the forged transfers and froze suspect accounts. The notary's office was audited for lax verification procedures. The notary who'd signed off on the forged documents was reprimanded. Eliza's boutique dream, that shiny car and the insufferable enthusiasm at family dinners, had been financed with funds traced, in part, back to the transfers she'd orchestrated. The boutique's lease was frozen pending an investigation. Neighbors who'd once nodded politely at my parents now shied away when my mother's car pulled up. Legally, the case was messy. Family crimes almost always are. Emotions get tangled with evidence, and the law has a tendency to move in slow, deliberate steps. But the auditor's report and Jonah's subpoenas built a skeleton of facts that made it difficult for anyone to simply walk away. Eliza was charged with fraud and forgery. There were ancillary investigations into the sources of her funding and the notarial office. My parents weren't immediately charged with criminal intent. The state tends to prefer individual accountability, but they found themselves in a different kind of ruin, social and financial. Once banks placed freezes and once neighbors saw news stories instead of dinner table narratives, the credit lines dried up. Invitations to community committees stopped arriving. People started to pull away. What I had wanted, from the beginning, was not simply their downfall. It would have been petty and empty to hope for that. What I wanted, and what I eventually admitted to myself, was restoration. I wanted clients to feel safe hiring me. I wanted the conversations that had once been behind the backs and under the breath to stop. I wanted my own sense of self-worth back, untethered to their approval. The truth was, punishment is hollow if it isn't followed by accountability and change. But change, for people like my parents and my sister, rarely comes as contrition. For them, change came as consequence. There were moments when the personal cost landed like a physical thing. My mother called me once, voice small and brittle. "Asher," she said, "we didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." I listened to her carefully. "Intent matters less than actions," I said at last. "You gave her the tools." She cried a little, a raw sound I'd never heard from her before. It did not make me forgive her. It made me sad for the person she used to be, someone who had perhaps once believed the right things before the habit of choosing her golden child rewired every decision. Eliza, in detention hearings, maintained an air of entitlement even as her future narrowed. She tried to frame her actions as rescue missions for the family, as if stealing from clients and forging signatures could be read as heroic sacrifice. The judge, a woman who had no patience for theatricality, did not find that persuasive. The sentencing was not immediate. That's not how courts work, but the damage to Eliza's social capital was irrevocable. Her friends uninvited her from events. The boutique's lease was terminated. The bright future she had imagined, one built on charm and borrowed money, collapsed into formality, police statements, restitution orders, and, ultimately, the legal consequences of forging a life on someone else's work. For me, the fallout included small, unexpected victories. One of the largest clients who had briefly jumped ship because of the online smear publicly apologized and renewed their contract, saying they'd been presented with irrefutable evidence of bad faith attacks. A magazine that had once hesitated about writing a profile on my firm offered space for a piece on resilience and professional integrity. Those professional wins did more than stabilize my business. They returned to me a sense of agency I'd thought lost. Emotionally, I did things I hadn't allowed myself while everything was happening. I went to therapy, not because I was damaged beyond repair, but because I needed someone to help me process the tidal shift in my life. I rebuilt relationships with friends that the family drama had strained. I stopped pretending that silence equaled peace. I spoke openly about boundaries. I learned that setting lines isn't cruel, it's necessary. There were quieter, almost tender moments, too. Jonah sent a text after the auditor's report that simply said, "Good work." Lila showed up at my office with a cake and no fanfare, just to remind me that life kept going. Mr. Klein published a follow-up about the dangers of conflating family loyalty with ethical behavior, and, to my surprise, some of my neighbors called to say they were sorry for looking the other way. The human cost of their choices had become visible to people I respected. My parents moved out of the house that had smelled of aftershave and old carpet cleaner. They sold it quietly, and the photo albums that had once been a shrine to family theater were boxed and taken away. I watched from a distance as people who had once envied their social life now looked at them with something closer to pity. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. When Eliza was sentenced, a sentence that included restitution and community service, along with a period of supervised probation, she looked at me directly for the first time, without the performance. There was no melodrama. Her eyes were tired in a way I hadn't seen before. She said, simply, "I have to live with what I did." There was no plea for forgiveness, no attempt to recast herself as a martyr. That was perhaps the only honest thing she said during the whole nightmare. I felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. The person I'd shared a childhood with had either been lost to entitlement or finally forced to face what she had become. Months later, life settled into a quieter rhythm. The brand I had worked on regained its footing and then thrived. The people who mattered to me, the ones who came through, stayed. The rest drifted away, as they tend to do when relationships are clarified by truth. I continued to get messages from strangers thanking me for stepping forward. People who had been bullied by family members into silence and who found, in my experience, permission to set boundaries. There is a bitter satisfaction in watching someone's house of cards fall, especially when that house was built on lies. But sweeter than the fall was the way my life reassembled itself from the wreckage. I did not become a caricature of revenge. I did not shout triumph from the rooftops. I rebuilt, calmly, decisively, with the kind of care I'd once hesitated to show myself. Where I might once have been ashamed to take up space, I now occupied it with purpose. One late afternoon, months after the gala, I walked past the boutique that never opened. The windows were dark, and a for lease sign leaned against the glass, its colors faded from sun. I thought of all the family dinners, the sly jokes, the invitations that had been thinly veiled demands. I thought of the man who had stood in my doorway months ago, and the legal team who'd turned over stones until truth crawled free. I paused for a moment and felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a very long time. A clear and steady peace. It wasn't triumph so much as completion. The scales had been balanced, not by vengeance but by consequence, and the people who deserved to bear the weight finally did. Walking away from the dark storefront, I pulled out my phone and typed a short message to Jonah. "Thank you for everything." He replied with one word, "Finally." And as I slipped my phone back into my pocket, I realized the best revenge had never been to destroy them. It had been to build a life so solid that no one could shake it again. The last thing I heard before I turned the corner was someone behind me, a woman who had once dismissed my work, saying softly to her friend, "He handled it the right way." I smiled, not because I wanted applause, but because for the first time in years, my reflection in a shop window looked like the person I wanted to be.